He noticed the boy first. Sable Wentworth was standing at the edge of the property, taking stock of the damage the last winter had done to the old lodge's east wing when the child appeared at the fence line. 7 years old, maybe 8. Small for his age, with the careful stillness of a creature that had learned to make itself unnoticeable. He was watching Sable work the way certain children watch things. Not with curiosity, exactly, but with a quality of attention that felt older than his face. Mabel set down his measuring tape and went back to the wall. The boy stayed. This was how it started, before Ingrid Voss arrived, before any of it mattered the way it would later matter. On an October morning in Jasper, Alberta, with the mountains doing what they always did in October, which was remind everyone that summer had been a temporary arrangement. Sable had not planned to be in Jasper at all. The contract had come through his cousin Derek, who ran a small renovation outfit out of Edmonton and had more work than hands. A heritage property outside the national park boundary. Former fishing lodge, 12 rooms, original log construction from 1947 with 2 additions, neither of which matched the original and one of which was actively failing. The owner was a development company out of Vancouver. They wanted a structural assessment and preliminary restoration scope. His name would appear on no public record. He would be in and out before the first snow. He had driven up on a Sunday with his tools and a week's worth of groceries, and had not spoken to another person for 3 days. The boy at the fence was the first. Name was Mattis. Sable learned this not because the boy told him, but because a woman from the property next door appeared 10 minutes later, apologized for the intrusion, and said Mattis had gotten out again, which implied this was a pattern. She said he was fine, he just wandered toward sound, specifically toward tools and the kind of rhythmic work that produced a consistent noise. She said this with the careful plainness of someone who had explained it many times, and was no longer embarrassed by it, just tired. Sable said it was fine. She collected Mattis with a practiced gentleness, and they went back through the fence gap. The next morning, Mattis was at the fence again. Sable left the gap alone. Ingrid arrived on the Wednesday. She did not announce herself. A black SUV pulled up, and she stepped out in a coat that cost more than most of the tools in Sable's truck, looked at the lodge the way people look at things they have already decided about, and said she would need to walk the property before she signed anything. Sable said he would take her through. They walked for an hour. He showed her the East Foundation, the plexud, where the 1989 addition had been bolted to the original structure, with a method that suggested the contractor had been optimistic rather than competent. He showed her the roof joists in the north wing, intact, genuinely remarkable for their age. He said the bones were better than the report had indicated. He said if she was thinking of tearing it down, she was making a mistake. She looked at him with an expression that people in her position often used when someone said something they hadn't expected to hear, not offended. Recalibrating. She said she wasn't thinking of tearing it down. He nodded and went back to work. That evening he was doing a final check on the east wall when he heard her on the phone through the open window. Not the words, just the register. The controlled cadence of someone accustomed to managing information rather than sharing it. He recognized it without judgment. He had been around people who inhabited that register for a long time in another life, in rooms that no longer existed for him. Mattis appeared at the fence at 7 the next morning, which was earlier than usual. Sable was already there. He had started bringing a second granola bar without thinking about it. He left it on the fence post. Mattis looked at it for a long time, and then ate it in 4 precise bites without taking his eyes off Sable's hands. Sable was working a section of original log that had weathered but not rotted, drawing a spokeshave along the surface in long pulls, listening to what the wood told him about itself. The sound it made when the blade was angled correctly was close to a tone. Consistent, low, something between a hum and a breath. Mattis moved from the fence to a spot on the ground 6 feet away and sat down. He did not ask permission. He did not look to see if Sable minded. He simply relocated, the way a cat finds a patch of suns, with the uncomplicated certainty of something, following an instinct it did not need to justify. Sable kept working. Ingrid found them this way when she came around the east side of the building at 8:30. She stopped. Something crossed her face that she did not allow to stay long. She looked at her son sitting on the cold ground 6 feet from a stranger, watching the man's hands, with an absorption she recognized and had rarely seen directed anywhere except his own private activities. And she stood very still and did not say his name. She waited until he felt her presence and turned. He did not look alarmed. He picked up his granola bar wrapper from the ground with careful attention and stood and walked to her and took her hand, and they went inside. She came to find Sable afterward. She said she was sorry for not mentioning Mattis sooner, and that he lived with her for the duration of the project because his usual schedule had been disrupted, and that he was. She paused in the middle of the sentence in the way of someone choosing the most efficient word. Particular about new people. Sable said he had noticed. She looked at him. He said it without any particular meaning. Just an observation. The boy was particular, so were most people worth knowing. She left. He went back to the log. That night, alone in the small caretaker's cabin the property had provided, Sable sat at the table with a cup of tea and did not open the folder on the counter. The folder had been there for 6 days. It contained documents that needed his attention and a letter from a professional organization that had been forwarded 3 times because he had moved 3 times in 4 years. He knew what it said. He had known what it said before he opened it. He put his hands around the cup and looked out at the mountains and let the night be what it was. He had been an acoustical architect. This was not a thing, he told people. He had designed spaces, specific kinds of spaces, for the better part of 15 years. Hospitals, therapeutic facilities, residential centers for children who experienced the world through sensation before they processed it through language. Children who were undone by noise, who needed a room to hold them differently than an ordinary room holds a person. He had learned the mathematics of it, and then he had learned the thing underneath the mathematics, which was harder to name and more important. The way a ceiling height changed the felt quality of a space, the way material absorbed or returned sound, and what that return did to a nervous system that was already working harder than it should have to. He had been good at it. He had been, for a period, considered one of the people in his field whose opinion on a project changed what the project became. And then Phoebe died. He did not think about it in complete sentences anymore. It came to him in images, in the smell of antiseptic in a particular hallway, in the sound of a notification tone on a phone that no longer existed. She had been standing at the corner of Portage and Main in Winnipeg on a Tuesday afternoon in March, which was the most ordinary thing in the world, waiting to cross, and a delivery truck had run the light. The Community Wellness Center in the Exchange District had been scheduled to open 10 days later. He had spent 4 years on it. Every room designed for children who couldn't tell you in words what they needed from a space, but communicated it through their entire bodies, if you knew how to read what they were saying. He had been one of the people who knew how to read it. He could not go in. He signed the completion documents from a hotel room. He left his firm in the hands of his associate director and drove north to Jasper, where his grandmother's cousin had left him a small piece of land with nothing on it, and he stayed. He had not designed a room since. He was very good at renovation work. He was honest about materials and did not overcharge and showed up when he said he would. These were not small things, and he had learned not to be dismissive of them. He went to bed and did not finish the tea. In the morning, Ingrid was already on the porch when he came out, which meant she had been up before 6, which was either ambition or insomnia, and her expression suggested the latter. He said nothing about it. He went to work. By the end of the first week, Mattis had established a location. Not near the fence anymore, but on the south corner of the lodge, on a piece of ground that received morning sun. He brought things with him. A small bag with a zipper he opened and closed with regularity. A book with a red cover he did not appear to be reading so much as holding, a smooth stone he turned in his hand. He occupied his corner with the thorough self-containment of someone who had made peace with his own company, and found it sufficient. When Sable worked on the south wall, they were close. Neither of them spoke. The spokeshave made its sound, and Mattis turned his stone, and the morning passed. On the 9th day, Sable was working a section of interior log in the main hall when Ingrid came to the doorway and watched. She was good at watching without being obvious about it, but he had spent enough of his life in rooms with people who needed to understand a space before they entered it that he recognized the quality of attention. She was reading the room, not the room's condition, the room itself. Its proportions, the way the old windows placed the light. He said, without looking up. The hall used to be bigger. They partitioned it in the 70s. You can see the ghost of the original east wall in the floor. She came in and looked at the floor. There it was, a faint line in the wood where the old boards ended and new ones had been fitted. She crouched down and looked at it closely. How much bigger? Enough to matter. He stopped working and looked at the room properly. The acoustic problem in this building is the partition. Everything reads flat because you're missing the original volume. Restoration means taking that wall out. She was quiet for a moment. That wasn't in the assessment. No. Why not? Because I hadn't been in here long enough to hear it yet. She stood up and looked at him, with the direct steadiness of someone who had been lied to by contractors before and was not yet sure what category he belonged to. He met the look and did not try to make it easier for her. She said she would think about it. He went back to the log. She left and came back 20 minutes later and said to go ahead and draw up what it would take. The following week, Ingrid's lawyer arrived from Vancouver. His name was Fenwick, which suited him. He was correct and efficient and stayed for 45 minutes and left a folder and drove back to the airport. Sable was on the roof when the car pulled out, and he watched it go without particular interest. That evening he heard raised voices. Not Ingrid's. She was not a raised voice person. The other was a man whose name he didn't catch, on the phone in the East Room, saying things about timelines and carrying costs and the exposure they were sitting on if this restoration dragged past March. He had the cadence of a man who considered urgency a professional tool. Morning. In the morning, Ingrid looked like she had spent the night managing something. Sable said nothing. Mattis was at his corner, turning his stone. Crouched. There was a man in town who had been watching the restoration with the visible interest of someone whose investment it was not. His name was Rupert Glaive, and he sat on the Jasper Municipal Heritage Review Board and had the particular confidence of a man who understood the mechanisms of local approval. He appeared at the property on a Thursday, uninvited, with the conversational ease of someone who had never found a door closed to him. He was warm to Ingrid, in the slightly proprietary way of men, who considered geographic proximity a form of ownership. He looked at the building and said, what a shame it would be if the heritage designation process became complicated, because these things had a way of becoming complicated when the approach didn't align with the board's sense of the property's character. Ingrid thanked him for stopping by. She offered him nothing that he could use and kept her face in an expression that looked like courtesy from a distance. After he left, she stood at the window for a moment before she went back to her calls. Sable had been in the next room. He thought about what Glaive had, which was leverage of a specific kind, the kind that lived in procedural ambiguity. He thought about what Ingrid might not know about how that leverage worked in a small municipality. He thought about whether it was his business. He decided it was adjacent to his business and let it sit there. Mattis had learned the sound the spokeshave made when the wood had a problem. Not a uniform sound, A catch, a slight resistance. The blade reporting something the eye hadn't found. He had started pointing at spots on the wall before Sable checked them. He was right more often than not. Not because he understood wood, but because he heard the difference in the way children who process sound before language sometimes hear the things adults have learned to filter out. Sable started pausing at those spots first. He did not make it a thing. He did not say good catch or well done. He just checked the spot and either found something or didn't. And Mattis watched, and the morning continued. One afternoon, Sable was fitting a replacement log section when Mattis made a sound. Not a word, a low note pitched somewhere in the range of what the spokeshave made on a clear pull. He held it for a moment and then let it go. Sable did not look up. He kept fitting the section, and after a moment, he made the same note back, in approximately the same pitch, while he worked. Not as an invitation, just as an acknowledgement that the sound existed, and he had heard it. Mattis made it again. They traded it back and forth 3 or 4 times, while the log settled into place. Then Mattis went back to his stone. Ingrid, who had come around the corner of the building and stopped in the shadow of the eaves, stood there for 60 seconds without breathing. Then she went quietly back the way she had come and sat in the kitchen for a while, with her hands flat on the table. She was not a woman who cried in front of structures. She was not a woman who cried generally. She had run the Voss Holdings Western portfolio for 8 years, inherited it at 31, from a father who had run it at 60, and considered it a training exercise to give it to a daughter first, and she had turned what had been a competent real estate holding company into something considerably more sophisticated through a combination of patience and the willingness to be underestimated. She was very tired, and she had been very tired for a long time, and she was used to that being the arrangement. She found out who Sable was the same way. She found out most things. She looked. Sable Renouf, Jasper, Alberta, a contractor's listing 14 months old. She refined it Renouf, architect, Winnipeg. The third result landed on a professional journal from 2019, a piece on acoustic design for pediatric therapeutic spaces, one of 3 authors. She refined it again. The first result was a profile in an architecture magazine from 2021. It had a photo. It was him. Crouched, she sat with it. The piece described the Exchange District Wellness Center as a generational project, a facility built on the foundational understanding that children who cannot use language to express what they need do not stop needing. It described the design philosophy in terms that she recognized because she had spent 7 years reading everything she could find about how to build a life around a child who experienced the world the way Mattis experienced it. The architect's name was Renouf. She had read the piece in 2021 and not remembered the name because she had been reading for the ideas, not the byline. She looked out the window. Sable was on a ladder against the south wall. Mattis was in his corner. She thought about what she would do with this information, and found, for the first time in a long time, that she did not immediately know. She searched his name again. She found the obituary. Phoebe Renouf, née Carver, March 2021. Beloved wife, it said, the way they always say that. She was 38. There was a photo. She had a face that looked like it laughed easily. Ingrid closed the laptop and did not open it again that afternoon. She chose not to say anything. This was not how she typically operated. She surfaced information. She used it to establish the terms of a situation before the other party had organized their position. She had not done this cruelly most of the time, but she had done it consistently, and it had served her well enough that she had stopped examining the habit. She watched him work through the week and could not locate the reason. If she told him what she knew, what would it accomplish? He would see the shape of the conversation shift around him, and whatever he had built here, this quiet life that moved at the speed of hand tools and October mornings, would have to accommodate her knowledge of it. She found she was reluctant to do that. She examined the reluctance once and then let it be. Glaive came back with a letter. It arrived as a formal communication to her legal team, citing a procedural matter under the heritage review process, specifically a question about whether the scope of interior restoration work required board pre-approval under a clause that had been added to the Jasper Heritage Overlay in 2019, and that she could be forgiven for not knowing about because it had been added quietly and applied inconsistently. She sent it to her lawyers in Vancouver. They said what lawyers say, which is that these things are manageable and the timeline is workable, in a tone designed to cost her the anxiety of worrying about them. She managed the anxiety and kept working. What she did not know was that Glaive had also been asking questions about the contractor. He had spoken to Derek Renouf in Edmonton, who was a sociable man who loved his cousin and did not see any harm in saying that Sable was the most gifted person with a hand tool he had ever worked alongside, and that he'd shown up 4 years ago, needing steady work and a place to be quiet. He had mentioned that Sable had a professional background. He had mentioned it without specifics, but Glaive was a man who knew how to make specifics from less. Sable found out from Ingrid, which meant she had been sitting on it for 2 days while she decided what to do. He was packing up one evening when she came to the workbench and set a coffee down and said, without preamble, that Rupert Glaive had been asking about him, and that she thought he should know. He was quiet for a moment. He asked what Glaive had found. She said she wasn't certain, but that a man like Glaive would not stop until he had something specific enough to use. Sable nodded. He finished coiling a cord. He asked her what she was going to do about the heritage letter. She said she was handling it. He said he would look at the relevant statutes. She started to say that wasn't necessary, and he said he understood that, and looked at her with the specific patience of someone who has made a decision and is waiting for the room to catch up. She let him. He produced a document 2 days later. He set it on her desk without ceremony and stepped back. She read it. It was comprehensive in a way that renovation contractors are not comprehensive, citing applicable provisions of the Alberta Heritage Act, cross-referencing the 2019 Jasper Overlay Amendment with the 3 prior board decisions that had applied it inconsistently, and providing a legal quality analysis of why the current scope of work fell outside the amendment's stated intent. A person who wrote this document had not merely read the statute. They had understood the architecture of the argument. She looked at him. He said, I don't want this project stopped. She said, neither do I. He left. That night she made 2 calls. The first was to her legal team. The second was to a journalist named Calloway at the Edmonton Journal who covered Western Canadian heritage conservation and who she knew professionally from a previous project in Calgary. She didn't tell him what to look for. She told him Rupert Glaive had been on the Jasper Heritage Review Board for 11 years, and that she had always found it interesting how some boards managed to apply procedural requirements so selectively. Calloway was a good journalist. He found the rest himself. By the following week, the heritage letter had been withdrawn, citing a procedural review. Glaive had stepped back from his public presence with the particular quiet of men who have been caught using the tools of their office for purposes adjacent to their office. The building permit was reinstated, but the local paper had already run a piece. Not Glaive's version. A follow-up by the local heritage reporter who had found Sable's professional history and considered it relevant to a story about a heritage lodge restoration in Jasper. The piece was respectful. It was accurate. It named the Exchange District Wellness Center and described what it had been built to do. Jasper is a small town in the way that places surrounded by mountains are small towns, tightly held, particular, with long memories and a distinct sense of who belongs. By the following Monday, people knew. They looked at Sable differently in the hardware store. He felt it without needing to identify it. The quality of being recognized when you have spent 4 years building a life in which no one recognized you. He came home and stood in the kitchen for a while, with his coat still on. Mattis found him. Before Ingrid did the next morning, the boy had let himself through the fence gap and was standing at the south wall of the lodge when Sable arrived, earlier than usual, because he had not slept after 2 in the morning and had stopped pretending he was going to. Mattis looked at him. He turned his stone once in his palm. Sable set up his tools. They worked in their particular way. Without speaking through the early part of the morning, the sound of the spokeshave and the texture of the cold air, the Rockies, doing what they do in late October, which is make everything else feel smaller in a way that is not unkind. After a while, Mattis reached into the bag he always carried and produced a folded piece of paper. He held it out. Sable wiped his hands and took it and unfolded it. It was a drawing, done in pencil carefully, with the deliberate line quality of a child who looks hard before committing the pencil to the page. It showed the south wall of the lodge, recognizable from the grain pattern of the logs. And in the corner of the drawing, 2 figures. One crouching, working. One sitting on the ground nearby, with a stone in his hand. Neither figure had a face. Neither figure needed one. Sable held the drawing for a long time. He refolded it with care and put it in the chest pocket of his jacket. He went back to work. Ingrid watched from the kitchen window. She had been there for 6 minutes, long enough to see the whole of it, and she was now looking at her hands on the countertop and practicing the breathing she had learned in a clinical waiting room in Vancouver 4 years ago, when Mattis's diagnosis had been confirmed and she had understood that her entire idea of what the next 20 years would look like needed to be rebuilt from different materials. She had rebuilt it. She was methodical and she was capable, and she did not, as a rule, need anyone to rebuild anything for her. She stayed at the window a little longer. The restoration finished in the 3rd week of October. The main hall had been opened back to its original footprint, the partition gone, and the space had recovered something it had lost in 1974, a volume that changed how sound moved between the walls, that made the room feel inhabited differently, held rather than contained. In the small room off the north corridor, a former storage space that had been on no one's work order, Sable had done something without being asked. The walls were paneled in clear pine, a pale, clean material that the light received without argument. He had fitted curved sections between the structural elements in a pattern that looked like a design choice and functioned as something more specific. The ceiling came down 4 inches from the rest of the corridor, which should have felt lower and instead felt settled. A single window, placed high, let in afternoon light that moved across the floor in a slow diagonal as the hours passed. In the corner, a small wooden bench, child-sized, sanded to a finish that was smooth without being cold. He had not invoiced for the room. Ingrid stood in the doorway for a long time. She understood what she was looking at. Not because she had read the journal articles, though she had read them. Because she had spent 4 years learning to read what a room said to her son. And this room was saying something specific, in a language she recognized. She found Sable at the workbench and stood beside him. She said, "You didn't have to do that." He said, "I know." She said, "Will you come back?" He was quiet, long enough, that she thought the answer was going to be what she had prepared herself for. Then he said, "The last room I built for a child like Mattis, I wasn't there when it opened." She waited. He said, "If I do this again, I need to be there." She understood that he was not talking about a room. She said, "Yes." The morning they were leaving, Ingrid was loading the SUV when she noticed that Mattis was not where she had left him. He was at the lodge door, which was unlocked. She started toward it, and then she stopped. Through the glass, she could see him. He had gone directly to the small room off the north corridor. He was standing in the middle of it. He looked up at the ceiling, and then he looked at the window, and then he turned, in a slow circle, the way children turn when they are trying to understand a thing by making their body part of it. Then he sat on the bench. He sat there for 4 minutes. Ingrid knew because she watched every second of it. When he came out, he was carrying the red-covered book he always carried, and his stone, and he went to the SUV and got in, and buckled himself with the focused attention he brought to all practical tasks. She stood on the gravel for a moment. Then she went and found Sable on the porch, and she took a card from her coat pocket. Her personal card, the one with only her name and a handwritten number, and she held it out. He took it and looked at it and did not put it in his pocket. He held it. She did not say anything else. She got in the car. Mattis, in the back seat, watched Sable on the porch until the driveway curved and the lodge went out of sight. Then he turned forward and opened his red book and held it in his lap. He did not read it. He held it the same way. Sable was still standing on the porch holding the card, with the specific care of someone who has been given something that requires a particular kind of attention. The kind you give to things you intend to keep. I keep thinking about the drawing. The one Mattis made. 2 figures on a piece of folded paper, neither of them with a face, both of them just there, in the same space, doing what they did. A child who had spent years unable to explain what he needed somehow found a way to say, this mattered, and he said it the only way he knew how. That's what stays with me about Sable. Not the career he'd walked away from, not the credentials he never mentioned, not even the room he built without anyone asking him to. What stays is that he showed up anyway. Every morning, with his tools and his silence, in a place he hadn't asked for, doing work he'd reduced himself to, not because it was beneath him but because it was what he could carry. There's a kind of integrity in that I don't think I fully understood before. It's easy to respect someone who's dream operating at full height. It takes something different to respect a person who has quietly accepted a smaller life, and is still doing it well, still doing it honestly, still doing it with care. I think about what it would have been easier for him to do. To take the renovation contract, get in and out, not notice the boy at the fence, not leave a granola bar on the post, not slow down enough that a child who processed the world through sound could find something in the rhythm of his work that felt safe. He didn't do any of that because he made a choice, probably without naming it as a choice, to bring his whole self to what was in front of him, even when what was in front of him was a fence and a quiet kid and a cold October morning in the mountains. And Ingrid. I think about what it cost her to stand at that window and not walk out. To know what she knew about him and not use it the way she'd spent a decade learning to use information. That restraint was its own kind of wisdom. Not every piece of knowledge needs to be deployed. Sometimes the most intelligent thing is to leave space for something to happen on its own terms. She'd built a career on control, and here she was, learning that the thing her son needed most was something she couldn't engineer or schedule or manage into existence. It just needed a room built by the right hands and enough mornings of not intervening. What Glaive did, trying to turn a man's quiet life into leverage, had a logic to it, but it was the logic of someone who mistakes power for understanding. He found what he thought was a weakness and pressed on it, and what he didn't account for was that the people he was pressing had more resources than he'd assumed. Not just legal resources. The kind that come from doing the right thing long enough that it becomes structural. Sable had spent 4 years building a reputation worth protecting. Ingrid had spent 8 years building a network that knew how to look at things carefully. What Glaive had was a procedural tool and a willingness to use it. It wasn't enough. Crouched. I'm not sure courage is the right word for what Sable did, coming back to the work that had cost him everything. Maybe it's closer to persistence. The kind that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't look like a comeback because it isn't trying to be one. He wasn't returning to who he was. He was finding out who he was willing to become. That's a different thing, and I think it's harder. And when Mattis sat in that room, in the corner, in the small chair built for exactly his size, and the sound from outside came through the window, arranged into something his body could hold. That wasn't a miracle. That was the result of a man who had done the work long enough and carefully enough that eventually the work found the person it was meant for. I think that's how most good things happen, if I'm being honest. Not all at once. Not announced. Just, someone kept showing up and eventually it meant something.